Faith and reason. Tertullian's famous motto, "I believe because it is absurd," may indeed describe those who reject reason in favor of faith. Other Christian thinkers have been accused of placing too much emphasis on reason to the exclusion of faith. So what is faith and what is reason, and are they compatible? Our objectives: define faith and reason. Critique each methodology that claims to apply reason to God. Identify the realist position on applying reason to God. Distinguish between belief in versus belief that. What is faith? Almost every major Christian thinker, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, has looked at this verse, Hebrews 11:1, as if not a definition of faith, at least a description of faith, and there is very little disagreement on what it entails. Hebrews 11:1, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen," from the New American Standard Bible. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see, from the New International Version. Faith is personal trust in someone based on their authority, because we do not have complete or direct understanding of the matter. In some cases we may question or not be certain about the authority, which may lead us to doubt or perhaps opinion, since again we do not know a matter directly. But faith can also be certain without doubting the authority, because the authority is so great and important and respected that we do not doubt them, and because it is the inner act of believing that produces faith, which is rooted in our will rather than our intellect. There are some things with respect to God we must accept by faith. For example, the Trinity is beyond all human capacity to demonstrate its truth, and is therefore accepted on the authority of God's revelation. It cannot be proved by human reason, and it cannot be disproved by human reason. It is a self-revelation from God, and its truth is based completely on the authority of God and His Word. We can certainly reason to show the coherence and the non-contradictory nature of the Trinity, but not its truth. What is reason? Thomas Aquinas says, "Whatever things we know with scientific knowledge, properly so called, we know by reducing them to first principles, which are naturally present to the understanding. In this way all scientific knowledge terminates in the sight of a thing which is present. Hence it is impossible to have faith and scientific knowledge about the same thing." When Aquinas uses the term scientific, it does not entail the modern subject today that studies nature or things found in nature. For Aquinas, scientific entails any truth that can be demonstrated from any subject or field of study. For Aquinas, this not only includes the natural sciences, but also subjects including philosophy. For Aquinas, if I demonstrate to you by philosophical argumentation that God exists, then you no longer have faith in God's existence, but you have a demonstrated knowledge of God's existence. Now you certainly still may have faith regarding other matters concerning God, such as the Trinity, but you no longer accept God's existence by faith, but have knowledge of it. This is why he says it is impossible to have faith and scientific knowledge about the same thing. And of course, for Aquinas and Christianity in general, the beatific vision, when we see God face to face, completely removes faith, since again we will see God face to face. What is reason? Aquinas says, "There is nothing to stop people from accepting on faith some demonstrable truth that they cannot personally demonstrate. There are all kinds of ways that we come to believe in God. We may accept it because our parents, or the Bible, or a pastor, or we may indeed just reason about it from creation. There are many ways that we might come to believe in God, and these ways are not mutually exclusive. And it's also important to understand that for Aquinas, faith is often more certain than reason, because reason is limited. It is limited in terms of its subject, which may be beyond our sense experience, or even limited in terms of the power of human reason alone. Reason is also limited in terms of some who simply lack the intellectual effort or ability, or even time to pursue a demonstration of God's existence. So again, faith is more certain in some cases than reason, because reason has limitations. Does sin affect reason? Aquinas teaches as follows: the good of nature that is diminished by sin is the natural inclination to virtue, which is befitting to man, from the very fact that he is a rational being. For it is due to this that he performs actions in accord with reason, which is to act virtuously. Now sin cannot entirely take away from man the fact that he is a rational being, for then he would no longer be capable of sin. Wherefore it is not possible for this good of nature to be destroyed entirely. While it can be said that sin affects human reason, it cannot be possible that sin completely destroys human rationality. For not only would we be unable to reason about that truth, we would also no longer be able to sin. The image of God, as Dr. Norman Geisler says, the image of God in man is effaced by sin, but it is not erased by sin. The image of God in man is marred by sin, but it is not removed by sin. Man still can reason and will after the fall, but his reason and will is bent away from the good standard that he should be following according to his nature. Reason applied to God. We'll look at 5 methods that apply reason to God. We'll argue against the first 4 and argue for the last one. First, skepticism. Skepticism was promoted by David Hume. Modern proponents include Anthony Flew, as well as A.J. Ayer. And it basically says that we should doubt everything about God. Agnosticism, espoused by Immanuel Kant, says that we cannot know anything about God. Rationalism, espoused by Benedict Spinoza, as well as René Descartes, says that we can rationally prove everything about God. Fourth, Fideism, espoused by Soren Kierkegaard, also Karl Barth, says that we must simply believe everything about God. In the fifth view, which we'll defend, Realism, espoused by Thomas Aquinas, as well as Neo-Thomist Joseph Owens and Etienne Gilson, as well as Protestants R.C. Sproul and Norman Geisler, says that we can know something about God. So we'll look at each view or method as it applies reason to God and offer a brief critique, and then defend the fifth view, realism. The first view, skepticism, from skeptics such as David Hume, says that we should doubt everything about God. Indeed, there are some questions we can ask. Why doubt that which has sufficient reason? If there's sufficient reason that God exists, then why doubt it, or continue to doubt it? Why doesn't the skeptic know whether or not God exists? And skepticism, we must admit, comes in at least 2 types. There's the hard skeptic that says you can't know anything about God. And there's the soft skeptic that says maybe we can know, but we just don't know right now. And the hard skeptic is ultimately self-defeating because he says you can't know anything about God. But not knowing something about God is knowing something about God. So ultimately, this view is self-defeating. And of course, the soft skeptic is open to a reasonable argument and evidence that can be given for God's existence. So this is a more favorable view with respect to God's existence. David Hume and others like him following in his skepticism says that we must have a complete suspension of all judgment with regards to the issue of God. But this again is self-defeating, since it implies a judgment being made with regards to God. The contention that all meaningful statements are either relation of ideas or matters of fact is itself neither of these. Hence, on its own grounds, skepticism in terms of a methodology applied to God is ultimately meaningless. Agnosticism, espoused by Immanuel Kant and others, basically says we cannot know anything about God. But we can, of course, respond to this is how do they know that we cannot know anything about God is true? That, of course, is something about God. The statement, I cannot know, is a knowledgeable statement. And every negative, not that, implies a positive that you know something. So it can't possibly be the case that we can't know anything about God, or that very statement would not be able to be known. In the philosophical system of Immanuel Kant, he says that things in thought do not apply to reality. However, unless things in thought apply to reality, no statements, including that one, can be made about reality. One cannot draw the limits of where appearance, or what Kant would call phenomenon, ends unless he knows some distance beyond it. Kant knows the noumena, or reality, the world outside of us, his word for that being noumena, is there, but not what it is. It's not possible to affirm that something is without declaring something about what it is. So ultimately, agnosticism, that we cannot know anything about God or reality, is self-defeating. Rationalism, such as Benedict Spinoza espouses, says that we can rationally prove everything about God. And since we can rationally prove everything about God, there is no room for faith. But this just goes too far. There are no rationally inescapable proofs for God's existence. It is possible that God does not exist. It's just not true that God does not exist, because there are demonstrable arguments or proofs for the existence of God. It is just reasonable that God exists. And the proofs that we do offer, again, are undeniable. It is not a logical contradiction or inconceivable for there to be no God. It has a logically non-existent possibility, but not an actual non-existent possibility. That is, God does exist, and we can demonstrate his existence through the proofs. Rationalism's thesis is the rationally inescapable is the real. However, logic is only a negative test for truth. There are no rationally inescapable arguments for God, and no rationally inescapable way to establish first principles. Hence, the existence of God cannot be demonstrated with logical necessity, but the door is still open to an undeniable demonstration. The other extreme of rationalism is fideism. Fideism, such as that espoused by Søren Kierkegaard, says that we must simply believe or have faith with respect to everything about God. Either fideists offer reasons or they do not offer reasons for their view with respect to God. If no reason, then it's an unreasonable view. If reasons, then they're not ultimately a fideist. If fideism is true, then there is no way to adjudicate conflicting beliefs or conflicting worldviews or views of God for that matter. And ultimately, fideism confuses belief in versus belief that. And ultimately, fideism confuses belief in versus belief that. In other words, we can demonstrate that God exists by reason, argument, and evidence. But this does not entail that someone must believe in God. Believing in God is different than believing that God. Believing that involves the intellect. Believing in involves the will. A fideist is right in what he believes about God and the Bible, but he is wrong in the reasons for that belief. There must be a test for truth, or he cannot even make truth claims. Fideism ultimately fails to clarify belief in and belief that there is a God. It is not possible to have a credible belief in God unless one has evidence that there is a God. One must have evidence to make the existential commitment of believing in God. Indeed, fideism stresses the basis for belief. The basis for belief in God is always just God himself, but it neglects the reason or the arguments for that belief. Belief that is intellectual. Belief in is existential, with no objective test for truth being needed. Finally, realism, from Thomas Aquinas, says that we can know something about God. It says that the mind knows reality. Sometimes this is called moderate realism, to distinguish it from Plato's absolute realism, or some view that says that we just know representations of reality in the mind. It says that it is self-defeating to know that you cannot know. We can reason from what is most known, which is the world, to what is less known or knowable, which is God. And this is what indeed arguments for the existence of God do, is they reason from things we know in the world to the existence of God. This reasoning does indeed give us imperfect or perhaps only analogous knowledge with respect to God, but it is still knowledge. The demonstration of the existence of God is a demonstration quia, as opposed to propter quid. That is, I look at effects and reason that they must have a cause. Even though I cannot match that cause with something else I know in the world, that is the created world, I still know that there is an effect, and of course can reason imperfectly or analogously from things I find in the world with respect to what God is. Such demonstrations are undeniable as opposed to rationalism's airtight logical certainty, but they are demonstrations nonetheless that again give us imperfect or analogous knowledge of God, but knowledge nonetheless. In this chart we see the role of faith and reason with respect to before faith, the act of faith, and after faith. Reason is present before, during, and after believing. However, reason alone cannot bring us to faith in God. Faith can never cause or be based on reason. If it were based on reason, then faith would not be an act of the will. Consent would be directly caused by the mind alone. But because it is possible for some to intellectually assent to truth, but not have faith, the two faculties must be distinct. At best, faith can only be supported or influenced by reason. As Dr. Geiser says in his book on Thomas Aquinas, reason can be used to demonstrate that God exists, but it can never in itself persuade someone to believe in God. Only God can do this, working by his grace in and through free choice. Before faith, we have reasoning in the mind, we have faith that is not believing in, and we have reason that, and the cause of consent being the intellect. In the act of faith, reason, of course, is present, but it is never a basis or cause of faith. We have the believing in as the act of faith, and the basis of that is faith and authority, or God himself. And this, of course, involves the will or consent. After faith, reasoning, of course, is present, but again, it is never the basis or cause of faith. And we have believing in, and its basis is faith or authority, and the consent is mutual between intellect and will. A good illustration of this is marriage. One may meet many who they reason in their intellect that they would make a good spouse, yet it is only to the beloved one that they stand at the altar and say, I do or I will to be in marriage to them, forsaking all others and fully committing themselves to the one person whom they love. Thus, again, the distinction between believing in and believing that. And this, indeed, is the key to the compatibility of faith and reason.